All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Athletics Canada webinar. We're very excited to welcome Clare MacMahon today, all the way live from Australia. My name is John LaFranco. I'm the manager of coaching education at Athletics Canada. Kyle Smith, our coaching coordinator, is in the background. He's going to be managing your questions. So just as usual, before we begin, you're muted. If you have the questions, you can put them in the question box, and we'll leave a little time at the end to answer those questions, hopefully, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. Vous pouvez demander vos questions en français et je vais traduire pour Claire. Mais on m'a dit qu'elle est de Montréal, peut-être elle peut répondre en français.
Bon. Je suis pas sûre de répondre, mais je vais comprendre, mais je fais pas
Okay,
de
no,
trucs con. Yeah.
no problem. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted in the coming days on the AC YouTube channel, and coaches who've entered their NCCP number and are NCCP certified will receive 1 PD point for their participation. So, Claire, I'll give a little introduction about Claire. Claire is an associate professor in sport and exercise science at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. She's active internationally in skill acquisition. Is a founding executive committee member of the Australasian Skill Acquisition Network, which brings together sports practitioners and researchers. Claire's background in combining psychology and human movement studies, this has allowed her to work in a broad range of areas in skill development and judgment and decision-making. Claire has collaborated with sport at all levels in her research, including elite Australian sports like AFL, Australian football, Australian Institute of Sport, Tennis Australia, as well as internationally the Canadian Football League, UEFA, and FIFA, soccer. And Claire's main driving interest is understanding how humans can perform complex skills that have motor and cognitive components, and how factors such as mental fatigue can influence this. And so this is what we're going to talk about today, is this idea of mental fatigue. A super interesting topic to research, because I think that as coaches, we all kind of know it and we've seen it, how skill breaks down when someone's tired, but like, how does that happen? Why does it work? So the first question I'm going to ask is kind of like a question, Claire, about just some terms that that are in your research. So there's this mental fatigue, but there's another term called ego depletion. So can you kind of maybe talk about those two and the difference between those two?
Yeah, sure. And to throw another one at you, there's also cognitive fatigue. So we've actually moved from talking about cognitive fatigue, which we argue comes from mainly cognitive tasks, to mental fatigue that's more encompassing. But that distinction between ego depletion and mental fatigue, ego depletion, people talk about this as, you can also term that, here's another one, as self-control depletion. So the idea is you have tasks that require you to control your behaviors. So those could be things like resisting eating chocolate cake, and it could be making yourself go and train when you don't want to train. So that uses conceptually this resource of self-control that you have. And then the idea of that is that any task afterwards, you may have less of that resource to exert. So again, in that example, because I've had to make myself pay attention in class all day, now it's a little bit harder to push myself to keep running, or to even just go to training. And so that's distinguished a little bit from mental fatigue, where mental fatigue is arguably a little bit more of a broader term, that it's like you have this feeling of mental tiredness, you can't think as clearly, it requires a little bit more effort. So in some ways, it's a little bit of a straw man. They really refer to similar things. In the research, some people argue that self-control tasks are shorter tasks. They're, something that's 30 minutes or less. And that, a mentally fatiguing task is something that's longer in duration, like you're, writing an exam for 2 or 3 hours, that's mental fatigue. In our group, we kind of argue that they're kind of the same thing, because having to, and really what it comes down to is effort. They're both, so we would argue that having a self-control task, that even though it's only 30 minutes or it's even, 15 minutes, it's still a way to get into being mentally fatigued. So that's why I kind of think the mental fatigue is like a broader term, but they're both ways into having this feeling of you've expended effort and it's more effortful to do the next thing. So when we look at the research, there aren't a lot of good, especially when we come from the lens of looking at how mental fatigue or ego depletion or self-control depletion influences physical performance. We haven't done a good job of really clearly saying they're very different. The one thing that you could do that hasn't really been done is look at, if it's not really a mental task, if you are trying to not express emotion, so you have to control your behavior, there are still arguments that it still leads to mental fatigue. So I guess my answer to that is, in the research, people make some distinctions. We argue that they're a little bit arbitrary. We're not convinced that they're really different. And it boils down to the effort that's expended and that has an impact on how you perceive the next task that you're going to do.
Awesome. So this has made me think of something. So already going off script, but I remember coaching at McGill, which you went to McGill. And there was a young woman who I was coaching, and she just had so much trouble training and I couldn't understand it. Like she wanted to hit certain times in workout, she never could. She was always just toast. Every now and then she'd have a really good workout, and then I was talking to her and trying to figure things out. And one day she kind of mentioned, she's like, yeah, like I have my final music, whatever. I'm like, oh, your music? She's like, yeah, I practice the piano 8 hours a day. And I was right away, I was like, oh, like this is information that I need to know, because clearly practicing the piano for 8 hours a day is like, that's like doing like a whole bunch of track workouts, right? Like that's a lot.
Yeah.
So I think practically for coaches, like knowing, knowing what athletes are doing and how their day is going is going to have a big impact on this, because you can, you have to be able to adjust. So this leads me to my next question though, which is, how do we measure these things? Like as a
Yeah.
coach, if I want to, know how tired is my athlete, how am I going to measure it?
Yeah. And this is also a really tricky area. The best way, I mean, there are all kinds of behavioral things that you can do that require a lot of like expensive, sophisticated equipment. Like you can use, uh, FNIRS, which is optical measures of brain activity. You can use EEG and that sort of thing. That's not practical, right? And there's things like pupil dilation. The best thing, and we often argue that mental fatigue is kind of like pain. It's a subjective experience. So the best thing is ratings, is, scales, ratings. We would say that if you do within, and we've got a student in the lab who's looked at all of the different types of subjective ratings. If you use something that has like a 1 to 5 and you have a 3 and 3 says normal, you kind of want to avoid that, because you want people to feel like they can report that they are mentally fatigued and not shy away from it, and kind of be truthful in what they're saying. And it's normal to have high mental fatigue at different points. So your athlete who came in and they've just maybe even had a concert that day and then had, debrief and then had more practice, you would expect them to be rating it high. So anyway, to come back to that. So we would say like 100 millimeter scale, and you're indicating from 0 or from 1 to 100 how mentally fatigued you are. But you can do something very simple, excuse me, like a 5-point scale, a percentage of mental fatigue, just something that is giving you an indication that you can kind of track over time. And even conversations sometimes, depending on the athlete. How are you feeling? That there might be more descriptors that as you get to know them, like I'm cooked mentally, but my legs feel good, or you get that distinction as well between the mental and the physical. And as they learn to calibrate themselves, I think repeatedly doing it is also important. And you can pair it. I mean, one of the things that we've talked about a lot in our lab group lately is using multiple measures, like not just mental fatigue, but like readiness to perform. How ready do you feel? Do you feel switched on or not? And some of it, so from the research, this is it's a big issue. But you can go from simple to you can go to using multiple things, and depends on the frequency as well, depends on the resources you have. I hope that gives you a little bit of a picture of,
Yeah, definitely.
some
I think
ideas.
I think it's good to hear, because I think as a coach, I like to try to use metaphor with the athletes as much as possible, um but it's also important to understand their metaphors. So you kind of use the word
Yeah,
like, oh, I feel cooked. Well, what does that mean to you, right?
yeah,
And so the first time you didn't figure it out, but then eventually you get to know, and then it's sort of like that's their cue that they mean that they can't do a certain amount of whatever.
yeah.
So I think
Or they
that's
feel
really great.
slow
Yeah.
might be very different to cooked.
Hmm.
Like slow might be like, yeah, I'm engaged, but I'm just not making the connections. And there can be different, the really challenging thing with this is there are a lot of different aspects for mental fatigue, and it overlaps with a lot of different things. You might have had a really emotional day,
Hmm.
and that can leave you
Yeah.
feeling mentally fatigued, but that, you might feel like you want to get some energy out. So there's these
Hmm.
really interesting feelings that you can have that you can kind of, I agree with that. I like that idea of metaphors, and another athlete, it might be a battery is a metaphor for them. And they have a physical battery and a mental battery, and it's like, well, I'm like a phone battery, I'm okay, could
Hmm.
use a little charge, but I'm okay.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So is there a way to help athletes train to push through this tiredness? So the way we didn't talk about this, but the way that I read it in the research is that the brain, when it's tired, is kind of balancing like the cost and benefit of doing the thing because it's tired, right? So is there a way we can train the athletes to kind of to decide to do it more than even
Yeah.
though they're tired?
Yeah.
Without, I
It's
guess,
a,
without hurting them in a way, because we know it's going to run them down. So they have to kind of
yeah.
time it. But yeah.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, is that balance of not hurting them. And it's kind of understanding, is this an acute thing or a chronic thing at the moment? So are you feeling like this because you've had 4 weeks and you're dealing with, a parent who's sick and it's an ongoing thing? Or is it because you had a day that you had a meeting that was really taxing? And so I think, just as an aside, I think that's an important distinction as well, this
Mm,
acute versus chronic, because then you go into these areas of burnout, right?
mm,
So that is an important point. I would say that training, like, you could probably do some things where you have, like, you even purposefully manipulate so that you have people performing when they're a little bit fatigued, and they can figure out some different strategies for themselves. But I think the main thing to come back to is, yes, that's exactly right, that you make these decisions of, is this worth it or not, to push through. And what makes it worth it is the motivation. So the way that athletes overcome it is because it's, a really important race, or, when it's training, um, it's a really important training session, or, they make those decisions. So I think it's reinforcing the motivation is one way to potentially say, when you're feeling like this, um, what's your reminder for why you're doing this? And what's your long-term goal for why you don't want to give up on a training session because you think you're in this acute state that it's a little bit harder?
right.
And reminding that. So the motivation helps you overcome that, and that tips that balance of, this is worth it, as long as I know that I'm going to be able to recover.
Right. Are there certain types of training? So kind of getting into the skill bit, like I think, just say for a distance runner, if someone came in and was really bagged, I might, say, okay, why don't you do like a threshold run, because you can do that by feeling. I'm not worried about what the pace is. you can just kind of go out and do it, versus if someone's like trying to execute some hurdle drills or something like that, if they're tired, it might, might not be good safety wise. And you also don't want to, kind of learn sort of bad motor patterns or whatever. So are there certain types of training that, are kind of more green light, yellow light, red light for this sort of thing?
Yeah, I don't think it's as clear as being able to say that. Again, I think some of this comes down to that judgment piece of, um, generally how much cognitive demand is this session where, yeah, making a technique mistake, like if it's hurdles or something, might result in an injury. Making that judgment and pulling that back, I think, as you suggest, is a good approach to that, and just looking at that balance between, can I, we almost, another student in our lab group looks at the demands of, we're really good at looking at what are the physical demands of different types of training sessions, but we tend not to consider what are the cognitive demands. So if you can get a balance between something, and sometimes you have high, high physical demand and high cognitive demand. And if you can get something that maybe back off of that, exactly as you're suggesting, that's something to consider. Or, I mean, the other one, just simply for training, is to try to get in and intervene, not just accept that I'm mentally fatigued, but kind of get in and intervene and try to have some recovery of the mental resources before your training. And there are a number of different ways that you can do that.
Okay. Okay, well, why don't we talk about that then? Can you tell us
Okay.
what are some ways to, I don't know, to like kind of unfatigue yourself, or
Yeah.
bring yourself back up to the baseline?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different things that have different levels of research. So there are some really simple things and almost kind of surprisingly simple things. So just having a break, and some time to just, chill out, to things like nature. So exposure to nature, and that could simply be a video. So walking through
Wow.
nature has some, it's been shown to have some really good impacts on regenerating our cognitive resources and just recovery, and it's restorative. One of the reasons walking through nature can be that little bit better than just a video is that there are also effects with odor. So these like pleasant nature, like not super pleasant, just like, pleasant nature, like odors, like citrusy, green, floral, chosen by the individual. If someone doesn't like the smell of lemons, then obviously that's not going to help them.
Sure.
But those sorts of things are really interesting ones that help bring back the cognitive resources and get some rest. Caffeine is definitely one. That's one that, like personally, I'm pretty sensitive to caffeine. And, if you're dealing with younger athletes and there's dosage, and then for me, like there's an immediate effect, but then you need to be looking at that long term. If you've got a training session and it's at 7 p.m, someone's taking caffeine, and then there's sleep and there's longer. So personally, I'm a bit of a, let's look at these other things that you can use. Music is another one that there's research to show. Yeah, so there are quite a few ways to get in there and look at what works for individuals as well.
Mm. That's yeah, that's really interesting. Those are all things that I think that I've used, but not, on purpose because I didn't do
Knowingly.
research or anything. You just kind of,
Yeah.
you're like, oh, I need to get out of here, and you go for a walk, and then you're like, oh, that's better, right? And it's just
Yeah,
something
and
that
that
happens.
and that has a couple of things, right? That could be just the break of changing the activity. It could be the low impact physical activity, and it could be exposure to nature, and it could even be the odors in nature. So like, if you can find something that does all of that, and
Yeah.
even
Listening to some music on your headphones while you're
as you
outside.
do it,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very cool. So another sort of, I guess, nomenclature thing or something, you talk about tasks that are engaging versus boring. And so
Yeah.
what matters about the distinction between engaging or boring tasks, cognitive tasks?
Yes. Yeah. So I think so. a classic example of like a boring one is we use one experimentally where it's a clock and you're literally watching a dot move around a clock. And that's a boringly fatiguing task.
That sounds
Be-
awesome. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, it's actually interesting. I suffer quite a bit from bouts of mental fatigue and chronic fatigue. And
Yeah.
we were using something we were testing, and I actually found that task really relaxing because so there are these individual differences, right?
Yeah.
But I think the reason I found it relaxing was because I could engage with it, but it was low demand,
Mm.
right? Whereas it's a boring task because people find it's not engaging and
Mm.
they have to keep doing it from resistance.
Mm.
So that's a boringly fatiguing task. Whereas something else where you are processing a lot of stimuli and there's like kind of a time pressure in it, there might be a challenge to it. So that challenge makes it engaging, but it's also drawing on a lot of your resources because it's challenging. So that makes it fatiguing from that perspective as you go over time, and you just simply can't keep doing it, even if you want to. So there is this resistance to a boring task, and less of that resistance to an engaging task. So, and we could think about that as things like video gaming, right?
Mm.
So you want to keep engaging in it, even though you're tired, and it's that motivation piece again. So you're motivated to continue, but it is fatiguing. So that's that difference between the two of those types of tasks.
And do they have a different sort of kind of impact on performance after the fact? Like if you're doing a boring thing all day versus doing an engaging thing all day, are you differently tired for your training?
Yeah, so there's some different kind of nuances in that. We did find that the boringly fatiguing task, although it wasn't like, this is just one study in our lab, but was more detrimental to doing a running task afterwards. In a sense, you were going against that resistance if you really wanted to stop doing it. And that was really almost under activating.
Mm.
Whereas the challenging task, you're fatigued, but you're kind of activated from it. So there's some indications that the boringly fatiguing is maybe a little bit more detrimental to your performance. It's not really clear at the moment, but you can almost think of that as it's an affective, like emotional reaction as well, that you don't have that joy in having engaged in the task. You have that frustration of really wanting to not engage in it anymore. Whereas with
Mm.
the engaging task, there's more of a positive association with it, even though it was fatiguing.
Mm.
So it's not really clear that there's there's not enough of evidence to base to say that there is a really strong difference, but there may be.
See. And what about within the performance task? So here's two examples. So running a marathon, that can be a kind of boring mental task because the physical effort at first, relatively to an athlete who's trained for it, is quite low. Like you're
Yeah.
actually not exerting yourself that much for the first part. It's really more the mental focus of like, I can't push and get to that engaging kind of state of running because that will be bad later. So that's kind of a boring, performance task. But then you have something like, say, like a decathlon, which is a whole bunch of, intense skilled things, and it's over a period of 2 days. And so you have to be engaged because you have to be hyper focused on all of the different parts of it. And obviously it's your performance, you're into it, but then it's also like it's very tiring. So how do you mitigate those two types of things within the day? Like in decathlon, would you kind of take breaks like similar to we talked about before? But then what about the marathon? How would you try to mitigate the
Yeah.
boringness of that?
Yeah, like one is kind of ongoing. So I
Mhm.
think to start with the decathlon, I think you're absolutely right. And I think coaches and athletes do this naturally, right? Like you shift your focus so that you've got this intense focus, then you've got this period where you don't, and that's kind of regenerating. And it can be writing in a journal, even between trials. We know there's
Yeah, the high jumper, yeah.
the high jumper in
Yeah.
Australia who does that. And that's,
Yeah.
this is where a lot of the sports psychology comes in, because attentional focus is also limited. You need to relax it and then be able to focus again. And I think in marathon running, it's a really interesting one. It is it's a self-talk and a goal setting, and it's also an attentional focus. And there's different bits of research that have looked at running and different distances and intensities of an internal focus. Do you focus on your mechanics? Do you focus on your breathing, associating with the task or dissociating from the task? Do you associate and you think about pacing? So it's still the task, but it's external, or are you looking at the scenery? So there are a number of different ways. And to me, again, it kind of comes back to that motivation, and it's just strategies within that. And I would say that we don't really look at it being boring or phases of it being boring as a detriment to your energy within that task. It's a really interesting question that we haven't really looked at. But I think it's that task switching and it's that focus switching is the way that we know from other areas of research, like you regenerate your resources. Yeah.
So maybe like breaking up the race into sort of 5K, and then so after 5K, you just, you just take a mental break, and then, so that you kind of have those, because you don't want to check out. If you check out mentally in a race, that tends to be bad. But if you plan, a marathon is long, if you plan those checkouts, you give yourself 10 steps or however, and then you get back in, that can save the mental energy across the board.
Yeah. Yeah. And it could be for this phase, I'm going to, even do something that is more cognitively engaging, that, I'm going to challenge myself to count every second letter of the alphabet, or
During the
something
race.
Something interesting.
Okay.
That I don't know. I might be throwing something
I don't know. It's
too
interesting.
crazy out
Well,
there.
so it's interesting because based on, I believe on some research by Brad Young, that we both know.
Yeah.
Maybe not, but I forget. Anyways, at one point I was having the athletes I coach run their intervals, but as they're running them, I asked them to recite the alphabet out loud backwards. And and the one athlete who hated this the most was the athlete I coach who went to the world championships, the marathon, the highest level. And she did not like this exercise, and she did not feel like it was useful at all. So I
Right.
wonder if that says anything about that athlete in particular, about maybe that's just she already has her own strategies and she doesn't need that.
Yeah.
But in the training, I think the idea was that you kind of do that in the training to almost to try to automate what you're doing, so you kind of clear that space and you put something in your mind, so you're not thinking about the thing, and then you automate the thing. I don't know if that's accurate, if this even related to this. Just made me think of it because you said alphabet.
Yeah, yeah. No, it is. There's a whole area of research about your focus of attention. There's kind of two different but related areas. One is when you're learning, and the other one is, what's your focus when you're performing. And that idea is that when you have a skill that you're really well learned at, it is automatic and you don't need to think about it. And when you do think about it, when I ask you to think about, your toe strike and every single detailed biomechanical, it actually kind of messes you up, and it facilitates and it helps you to not think about it. How hard that thing you're using when you're not thinking about it might be something to play with. If it's something you can change your focus, but it's really difficult, it might get in the way. But generally, if it's something like, reciting something, it can help something that is automated just come off on its own. And some of the thinking about that as well is that implicit learning is that when you're learning, trying not to have the learner think about all the detailed mechanics of what they're learning, because later on, when they're in a pressure situation, they may revert back to that
Mm,
and that it interferes, and that's choking. And that's the idea behind choking.
mm,
So whether in that case as well, if it's repeats of something that is difficult and physically aversive to do, and it
mhm,
distracts them from
mm,
that, feeling of effort, and
mm,
that may be a benefit as well. There may be something to that
mm.
in it as well.
Interesting. Okay, so can you think of anything else that, we can use from this knowledge to make training better, to sort of better set up training, keeping in mind the cognitive load?
Yeah. I think the first one is to think about it and have it within the planning a little bit. Have a think about, just reflect on what are the demands of the different training activities that you're doing. Um, I think, like we talked about, monitoring athletes and getting athletes to think about whether there are differences in different days, of the state that they come in.
Mhm.
Um, and also having those mechanisms, really simple things that when they come in, they say like, yeah, I'm fried today. I'm feeling really mentally fatigued. Having ways to adjust that a little bit.
Mm,
So it's kind of, thinking about periodization a little bit as well, of
mm. Okay.
how intense, if you've had a really intense technical and physically demanding training session the night before, and you have like a morning session or something, really looking at that. It's very much taking the lens of physical load onto cognitive load, and the
Do-
two of them together as well.
Is there a kind of standard, timeline that you can kind of unload this? Like just thinking about, we kind of know like, a steady aerobic effort, like you can kind of turn around and do that and recover in a day or even less. And if it's like a more intense effort, you need kind of like a 2 days or 3 days. Is there any kind of timing guidelines on this?
Yeah, it would be really good if we had that, wouldn't it? um, so there may be something in other areas of research that guides it, but I think we're so poor at measuring it really well, and at measuring what the stimulus is, because you have different stimuli that can lead to that mental fatigue. Um, I don't think we do have a really good guideline.
Mm,
And some of it also depends as well. It's not just, but which you would say for physical effort as well. How is sleep going as well?
right.
If you haven't had good sleep, your recovery from anything mental or physical isn't going to be
Mhm,
as good.
mhm,
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have a good answer to that for
yeah.
timelines, but I think you kind of would get to know that for individuals by
Mhm,
doing some tracking.
yeah. Yeah. And I
Yeah.
guess it's like the solutions we talked about before, those are more sort of short-term solutions
Yeah.
to kind of just
Acute.
buffer a little bit to be able to kind of do the session. But then
Yeah.
long-term, you're talking like sleep, nutrition, like the
Yeah.
usual things, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. And even just a break
Mhm.
every now
Yeah.
and then
Sure. Yeah.
of
Break from training. Yeah.
yeah, a break from training, break from, not, when you're dealing with athletes who are competitive, like everything they do,
Hmm.
oftentimes there's a personality thing around that. Everything is really high intensity.
Hmm.
Um, and it's that awareness of phases as well.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, but we don't have a really good answer to that at the moment. I think it is just awareness and tracking and working with individuals. Yeah.
Hmm.
And like you said, that broader picture of, that's where we want to make sure the acute doesn't become a chronic mental fatigue that then changes over into not just mental fatigue, but burnout and potentially even depression and those sorts of things. And then injury becomes a part of the picture.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, how does smartphone use impact this? Because I think that's something we hear a lot about, like people are on their phones 5 to 7 hours a day. And that I don't know if that's an engaged thing or a boring thing or like what,
Yeah.
is there reason to get athletes to ditch their phones? That's kind of what I'm asking, but
Yeah,
how does
yeah.
that impact?
Yeah, great question. Really hairy question, really
Mm,
complicated
mm,
question. So the short answer is we know there's some really nice studies that have looked at moving from these like lab-based tasks to fatigue people to using a smartphone. And
mm,
they've done studies where they show someone using 30 minutes. So they did a 15, 30 minute, 45 minutes of just using your smartphone. And then they did a task, which was, I think it was a soccer decision-making task.
mm,
And after 30 minutes and 45 minutes, there was mental fatigue and it negatively impacted the performance. So we have these kind of little indicators that right before, if you're on your phone for, I don't know if we consider 30 minutes an extended period of time, but that,
mm,
over 15 minutes, that 30-minute to 45-minute period, there is some effect on your mental resources. And that has a negative effect on anything that you do, both physically. I mean, we don't have strong evidence, but there's some indicators, but also cognitively, meaning that
mm,
anything, technique as well, you're not going to be benefiting. The 5 to 7 hours that we clock up in a day of using
mm,
our phone, it's probably more intermittent.
mm,
You may have those periods of 30 minutes, hopefully not 45 minutes. That feels like a really long time on your phone.
mm,
I don't think we know enough about that. Like the
mm,
thing that I think is a big concern that people look at is generally, does it influence your attentional resources? So you've got, a team meeting and the athlete just can't even pay attention because they've just habitually been using a phone where everything has to be short and sharp.
mm,
Um, so I guess taking all of that together, I personally am a digital minimalist, so
mm,
I'm very,
mm,
get used to having periods of time without it and don't have that dependence.
mm,
I think it does negatively impact us. There is also, you don't want to be, it's a fine line. You don't want to be taking away something that is a source of some relaxation. If it's like a
mm.
15-minute, 10-minute, or we're saying watch a nature video, well, I'm going to watch the
Sure.
nature video on my phone, right?
Right.
And it elevates my mood, and we know
Yeah.
that dopamine is a really big part of mental fatigue. So that's why I say it's a really hairy question.
Yeah.
um so I think it's a within reason, but
Mhm.
potentially using just that 30 minutes, say like 20 minutes, fine, but try not to go above that in
Mhm.
one kind of, and particularly right before you come to a training session,
Yeah.
instead, let's just sit and
Yeah.
relax, or yeah.
Do we know anything about, and maybe it's, the same answers as before, but like the difference between like if I'm spending those 30 minutes scrolling through Instagram versus like doing a chess problem or doing Duolingo or something like that. So sort of like
Yeah,
the boring engaging, but then there's also like
right.
I feel like the doom scrolling can also be like emotionally intense for some people.
True. Yeah. Um, I'm not sure if it's kind of getting into areas that I don't really know about. So anything I'm saying is kind of speculative, but I do agree there's like a really big difference between that. So and that is a really good way in to think about it, is engaging versus, yeah, like you said, boring, but there is an affective, like an emotion, and it's an attentional, it's almost like there's no really processing it. It's like a hit of next thing, next thing, next thing.
Mhm. Yeah.
Versus, yeah, I'm doing a Sudoku, or I'm, yeah, learning a language. And I always think that that's training, not just what you're doing, but it's training your attentional
Mm,
resources as well. It's also that task shifting,
mm,
right? So, when you've done an exam, and we say one of the ways to regenerate your cognitive resources is just change the task. So just
mm.
novelty changes
Yeah.
it. So,
Yeah.
but you want to be engaged in it
Yeah.
versus flipping through, you're not actually really engaging with it. So yeah, short answer, not sure, but I kind of think about it in the same way that you think about it. Yeah.
Any difference between like a phone and a computer screen? Just thinking of, people who are at work or just or doing school or doing schoolwork or something like that. Is it really more about the task itself than the device? Or is it just, usually the phone tends to have those more potential dopamine hit kind of activities, whereas if you're on a laptop, it's maybe not, I don't know, but like maybe less so.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, I mean, I think equally. So let's say email,
Mhm.
you can be shifting through a bunch of different tasks because you're processing in completely different spheres. By processing one email, that's about topic A, and the next one you go to right away, and it's about topic B, that's completely different. And
Hmm.
so I don't know that it's the device so much
Okay.
as, like you said, the way you're engaging with it.
Hmm.
Um, but I don't know. I don't know if that's, another area to
Yeah.
look at in terms of advice. Because again, it comes to that engaging thing, right? Like if
Mhm.
I'm reading a really interesting journal
Mhm.
article,
Yeah.
I'll find that I might be fatigued, but I'm also quite, oh, this is really cool. And it's one thing, and I'm thinking deeply about it.
Mhm.
And then if I just recover from that, that's a little bit better versus I'm kind of looking for stimulation. So there's one
Mhm.
is kind of engaging with something, and the other is kind of need for stimulation of, okay, next thing, that's not,
Mhm.
it's kind of a search versus an engagement.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's good. We don't mind wild speculations on this. Like, that's totally fine. Love it.
But I mean, I might go go find some research on that now that
Yeah.
like this is really engaging for me. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. That's it. So I mean, we haven't really talked about this yet. This sort of the skill acquisition. Is there a kind of like uh, I guess, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like skill acquisition or skill training is like you're acquiring the skill, you're developing the skill, you're maintaining the skill. Is it easier to kind of do skill maintenance work when you're tired? Is there a detriment to if you're tired, you're trying to do skill acquisition work? Is it like less likely to take, or maybe because you're tired, it's somehow more likely? Like, how does it work when you're trying to acquire a skill and then keep it?
Yeah, good question. Like I would go back to the challenge point framework where we look at how similar to the competition environment is it? So how specific, how representative is it? And then how challenging is it for that individual? And that challenge is different or how difficult is it? And that what's difficult for you would be different to what's difficult for me. Um, and and I would say that, yeah, you bring down that cognitive demand with it being less difficult, and maybe less representative of the area if there is that lesser ability to process the stimuli and like read the cues, and just go into more of that maintenance type of area if you're concerned about things like injury, for example, or over pushing.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. Yeah.
Okay, nice. Um, I'm trying to see what audience questions we have here. This is great. It's so great to have someone who can speak so uh knowledgeably and just kind of like easily on these topics. I appreciate you answering my questions, even though they're maybe a little bit kind of like here here
Hopefully.
here and there.
Yeah.
Um, so here's a question about if you're injured, is there an impact on kind of injury recovery in the sense that like if you're trying to do kind of rehab exercises or something and you're more tired, is that less likely to help the rehab kind of thing? I don't know if that's a good
Right. So
question or not.
does mental fatigue interfere
Hmm.
when what the training is injury rehab type of
Hmm.
thing?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, interesting. Like my speculation without insulting any physios, is that some of your rehab would be pretty low cognitive demand. You know, it's like repetitive, maybe strength training, which you don't have to put a lot of mental effort into. That's the other one that we haven't really used the term today, but talking about load, right? Well,
Load.
we did use load, but mental load and physical load, and how much load are you putting in? I would say that's pretty low effort. Where you'd want to be maybe concerned is with injury, you get all of those, you know, psychological factors as well, whether is it a precursor? Is the mental fatigue because there's some depression piece? And we know that mental fatigue is associated with a lot of things, like depression is one of the things it's associated with. You feel slower, you feel like things are more effortful. There's that emotion piece in it. And so if that's happening, there may be other things to be really mindful of as well.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. So here's another question from someone from the audience. They're anonymous, so we don't know who they are, but that's okay. Does repetition of a task in a fatigue state create better muscle memory?
That's a really good one. I have a colleague who really hates the term muscle memory, because we say, well, our memory is not in our muscles. Our muscles might act it out, but our memory is in our, like, not in our brains, but in our whole system. But that's an aside. Yeah, I think automaticity, I think that repetition does lead to automaticity. Sorry, I've gone off on a tangent. Could you repeat it? Because I don't want to, I want to make sure I've gone off, and I want to.
Does repetition of a task in a fatigue state create better muscle memory?
So I think that the short answer is probably yes, even though I focused on not using the word muscle memory. I think being able to overcome any, we would call them constraints, right? Something that interferes with your ability to do the task would be physical fatigue and mental fatigue. So if you can ensure that, I would say, and I'd be interested in coaches' views on this, if you can ensure that an athlete is going to be safe in doing it, mentally fatiguing them to a appropriate point where, you know, you're not doing something that's hugely, they're going to trip over the hurdle, for example, so that they can overcome those obstacles when they have them, I think is not a bad thing to do. So repetition, and we talk about in skill acquisition, you know, blocked practice versus random practice and repetitions. And we don't really like a lot of repetitions if we're trying to simulate what happens in the real environment. But there are certain phases of training where you do want to get high repetitions. And that is what you're doing, is you're getting that automaticity. You're getting that, for want of a better word, that motor memory. So it's, when you are fatigued, you don't have to think about it. So I would agree with that. And I'd say the challenge point framework tells you, and the post framework, when to use that, depending on the goal of what you're doing. Is your goal technique? Is your goal resistance for competitive constraints? Is your goal adapting? So you might not do repetitions when you want to be adapting, but yeah.
Okay. So another one here, not quite in the form of a question, but just maybe can you talk about how academic stress and demands can impact the competitive season?
I would say that they can impact it because there is another just general demand on the athlete. So there's the stress, and you could separate them out, right? There's the stress and there's the doing the actual thinking part of it. And this is where it all gets messy, right? So you could have spent a whole day studying, and then you've got a training session, or you've had an exam and you have a competition the next day. That's going to have an impact on the fatigue, the mental fatigue. But I would say you're moving from an acute to a chronic here, where it may impact the sleep, and then it's becoming difficult to recover. The stress will add to that load. So I think those phases, how it will impact it is potentially knowing when you need to pull back and when you don't. And so, you know, if you're a coach, and sometimes it's easier if you're working with a whole group of athletes from a university, you know their schedule, right? You can work around that, and you can know this is a busy time and pull back. That would be my overall answer to that. I think it affects your planning, it affects recovery, and the stress is different to the mental load. I mean, it's different, but it's cumulative, right?
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, I think it's all, you know, goes into the same bucket of the human, and you know,
demands.
yeah.
It's all about demands to me, and it's effort. And I suppose the other piece of it that it could influence is motivation, because your focus, you know, dual career athletes, it's a really challenging space, right? Because you've got two roles, and like the musician, were they training a music student that you talked about? Oh yeah, McGill. And that's an intense program as well. So you've got these two roles, and they're both demanding, and it's what's your motivation for one over the other. And during an exam time, you may be prioritizing the exam performance, and during race time when there's no exams, and it's like you might be prioritizing. So I think you might be more likely to push through. You know, we talked about when you're mentally fatigued, what do you do? And if as your motivation let you push through, well, it may not let you push through as much if your identity at that moment is more so of
of a student versus
an academic.
Makes sense. Yeah. Good. Okay. Well,
again, I am speculating a little bit and going outside of my direct expertise, but yeah.
That's all right. It's okay. Said, don't mind speculation. It's good. It's just good to, you know, just to throw ideas out there. It's all good. This is we're not a peer-reviewed journal right here. We're just having a conversation. So it's all good.
Thank God.
Yeah. No, but I mean, I think it's good to, obviously you're saying that. You're not saying this is what it is.
Yeah.
It's perfectly, you know, normal to have ideas. Anyway, I don't see any more questions. Maybe if people have taken a minute to like ask one more question, but I'm going to just remind people about our next webinar. And you know, very often we have webinars and they go so great. We say, oh, we should do another one. And so we're actually doing a round 2 this time. The transition from high school and club track to university. And so we have a few people back on that one that we did before. Kurt Downs, multiple time national team coach, head coach at Border City. Brett Montrose from Streamline Athletes, recruiting service. Carmen James, who's currently NCAA athlete performance advisor for Athletics Canada, and prior to that, head coach at UBC in Hawaii. And Glenn Smith, former 100 and 200 meter sprinter for Canada and coach at Central Florida and Iowa State, or not at the same time, but both of those. So yeah, so that's our next one. That's March 5th, 7 p.m. So Kyle is going to throw the registration. Do we have a way to do that, Kyle? Put it in the chat, or can we not do that here? I'm not sure, but it's on our website under events. You'll find it wherever you found the registration for this one. Oh, there we go. Kyle put it in the chat. Perfect. Yeah, so please join us for that. Okay, we have another question here. Oh yeah, okay, so we weren't really getting into this, but I think this is probably a good way to end, and we can see if there's an answer or not. Is there a difference in how mental fatigue affects male or female athletes, or is this just sort of a universal thing across gender?
There isn't. There was a review done looking at age, sex, physical fitness, a couple of different variables, and it didn't find any differences between males and females. One of the things that a PhD student of mine is looking at is personality type and whether that has an influence. So we have some indicators that this is in a team sport, however, but a more extroverted athlete, there may be a protective factor to that. So it might buffer a little bit against mental fatigue. Whereas someone who has high openness to experience, so they might, the way you might define that is someone who likes to seek out information, seek out new experiences. They're pretty open. That actually may be more of a risk factor because they are kind of stimulating themselves and they're engaging with a lot of different things. So while, and there's some indication that maybe there isn't a lot of work, but your expertise level influences it, that, yeah, there's one study that showed in cyclists, the more expert cyclists weren't as susceptible. So they had better cognitive resources, for want of a better descriptor, and they didn't get as fatigued. And so therefore it didn't influence their performance. So I guess for that, you could consider, is someone doing something in their work where they're in a new job and they're really upskilling and it's like really, really demanding. But no, so far, there's no indicator that males and females differ, but maybe by personality.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Like, I think, talking about extroverts, introverts, I think that's a bit of a, sort of a misunderstood thing as well. Like, I consider myself to be a bit of an introvert, and people who interact with me would probably go, What do you mean? Like, you're very, open and chatty and stuff like that. But it takes a lot out of me. Like, if I'm a teacher,
Exactly.
and so I can teach, I can go, I can coach, I can be out there, but then
Yeah.
then I'm done.
Yes.
As
Yeah.
opposed to like my work day where I'm just sitting by myself and emails and stuff, fine. But like that takes a lot less out of me than it does like, an hour of teaching, which is probably just normal anyways. But I just think I noticed for me that
Yeah.
a lot of interaction with people is very tiring, but other people they
Get
thrive on
energy.
it. They're
Yeah.
energized by it. So I think,
Yeah.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense that the
Yeah.
individuals, and that just comes down, that's coaching, right? You're coaching people and
Totally.
coach the individual and
But also don't
are,
assume, like you
yeah.
said, people think that you're an extrovert, and you have ambiverts as well, who exactly like, great when you're in it, but I need some downtime. And it's all about where you get energy, and that's where you get the idea of talking to your athletes about their energy, and the really self-aware ones are like, well, I'm going to need some recovery from this. We have generations that are coming up with a lot more awareness about, people talk about, I need to go charge my social battery,
Right.
or,
Yeah.
I've done this, I've had a really big social day on Saturday, so I need a me day on Sunday. And it's about energy, and the mental fatigue is about energy. It's where do you get energy from? So yeah, I find that a really interesting one. We were surprised that conscientiousness didn't come up, because people who they want to do a good job, they really put a lot of effort into it, or neuroticism. But yeah, it's just the start of understanding that. But we think that personality is a bit of a factor in there for sure.
Okay. Yeah. Fine line between conscientiousness and neurosity
Neuroticism.
Yeah. Okay.
Well,
Last
they're actually
question.
two
Yeah.
different ones, but anyway, yeah.
So we have one more question that came in from Royden Radowitz, who's actually, I believe, a grad student working with Brad Young. So there we go.
Ah.
Um, is there a transfer effect with training with fatigue? So if an athlete trains with consistently some level of mental fatigue, like from school, and gets used to that, could removing that fatigue in competition disrupt their typical way of performing?
Interesting. First of all, Royden, tell Brad he needs to respond to my emails. Um, uh, So secondly, sorry, I've distracted myself again. Does training with it and then removing it, like, I think the short answer is we don't know. We have these models of things like medical training, right? Where medical students will be training under, almost purposefully under, fatigue, so that it's this overreaching, right? If you're able to do something where the demands are greater than what you would encounter, then you're going to perform better. With mental fatigue, we don't really know. It's just starting to be an area where people are looking at training with fatigue, but it hasn't really been looked at. So great question.
Just like tapering, kind of. But
Yeah.
you'd want to rest, you would think. I think Gordon's question is more like, do you want to rest and taper, or is that going to be, because I think you can also taper
Oh,
too
I
much.
understand.
right? You can taper too
Right. Is
much.
it like you're turning off almost?
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
that the idea? Ah, okay. Yeah, that's a slightly different question. I don't know that you separate it out as
Mm,
clearly as that
mm,
so like, is it detrimental if you taper too much on the
mhm,
cognitive side?
mhm.
That's the,
Yeah,
I don't know that people do it enough
yeah.
that we can
It's
answer
pretty
the
hard.
question.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
an
But
interesting way to think about it though.
yeah, I could see like an example I can think of is sort of like, you're used to whatever daily life, everything like this, and all of a sudden you get the chance and you go on like a training camp or a competition camp, and you're now all of a sudden you're sitting in a hotel all day and you got nothing to do, and you're just focused on the race. And that is a shift in your sort of cognitive load, right? It's like it's much lower because you're just watching TV, you're doing nothing. So
Yeah.
that can be the idea of it is like this is good. This you can relax, but the idea of it might be that it's actually not great for people or something.
Yeah, like maybe it goes back to our engaging
Mm,
but not fatiguing and boring but
mm,
fatiguing. You want to get that sweet spot of something that's maybe not drawing on the same resources as what
mm,
you're going to
mm.
use in the
Yeah.
race or in the competition.
Mm.
But you've got this switching of tasks so that you're regenerating a little bit.
Yeah.
There was something else I was thinking of, but it's gone, so that's okay. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think
Sorry.
that's a good, no worries. Good spot to end. Thank you so much for this. It was such a great conversation. I feel like I learned a lot. Hopefully everybody else did too. And I feel like now we have to get Brad on now. I think that's the next thing. We got to go chase Brad down and have him come on here and basically you can answer your emails live that way.
That would be great. I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you
Yeah,
so much, Claire. It's been great,
my
and everyone
pleasure.
will have this posted on YouTube very, very soon. So, and we'll hopefully see everybody in March 5th for the transition from high school to university. Thank you for all the questions. Bye.
Thanks so much.